Obviously, there are minimal standards that are satisfied, 24 hours a day. However, where business is, that's where the liquidity obviously is going to need to flow. So this basically presents the challenge of a resolution of any one of these entities within this large enterprise potentially could bring down the entire enterprise as well as the financial system and economy. So that's sort of a quick summary of the challenge. Now, one of the, I'll call it, most important aspects associated with traditional insolvency processes, and Paul alluded to the ring fencing issue, is that when a subsidiary of one of these entities goes into an insolvency process, there is inevitably a fight for assets, because it is the obligation of the administrator of that process to basically collect and grab as many assets as he can for the benefit of the creditors of that legal proceeding. This happens in spades during traditional bank failures in the U.S. Almost all banks that fail, even the small ones, have a holding company, have a bank subsidiary, and there is inevitably litigation between the holding company and the bank itself over assets that were not clearly identified as belonging to one another, or how the value of those assets would be split among the two entities. Global cooperation, Paul indicated, one of the challenges around that basically is that ex ante you can have good agreements, good understandings. I'll even characterize some of those going to friendships, but at the end of the day, everybody has to stand from where they sit, and they have to follow their mission responsibilities and are going to be constrained not just by their statutory authorities and responsibilities, but also by the political dynamics at that moment in time. And that means that alignment of incentives and also understanding what will incent your counterparty regulator or counterparty resolution authority is very important. The operations and interconnectedness, obviously when you're dealing with a company that has literally thousands of subsidiaries. I remember having a discussion with, now this is a G-SIFI instead of a G-SIB, but with the fellow who was overseeing the restructuring of AIG in the United States. This was 6 months into the process, and I said, well, how many subsidiaries does AIG have? He says, well, we've counted up to 6,000 so far, but we're still working on a number. Okay? So obviously the way these entities relate to one another, and understanding that not just for somebody who is on the outside trying to see in and understanding where their risk position may actually reside, but also for a regulator or even the management of the firm itself is a huge challenge. Counterparty actions, I think everybody in this audience is very familiar with the issue around accelerating and terminating financial contracts upon insolvency. The initial thinking on this was that to mitigate the consequences of systemic contagion, it's best to allow counterparties to immediately terminate and net out of their agreements. That works well, certainly for a small failure in which a number of counterparties would wish to basically exit any type of relationship, get the liquidity associated with their interests and move on. But when you have a large failure, and I think we are actually fortunate for a Lehman example arising out of this, you can observe the fact that when everybody rushes to terminate their contracts at the same time and then sell the collateral, that has cascading effects and then results in an asset repricing problem. So in fact, you've entered now into almost a vicious cycle of where the termination of multiple contracts, the call of the collateral, the sell of that collateral, then results in further depression of prices, which then results for those healthy institutions having to basically obtain more collateral for their obligations, and there we have a systemic issue. And last but not least, funding and liquidity. Obviously, when one of these firms fails, anybody who has a short-term credit is either going to be withholding that ex ante or shortly thereafter. And as a result, there are always going to be liquidity issues for either, I'll call it the direct counterparty or the affiliates. Now, here in the U.S., we established through the Dodd-Frank Act a new insolvency authority called Orderly Liquidation Authority, also known as Title II. It has some very clear policy goals associated with it. One is that the owners and management responsible for the covered financial company's failure has to be held accountable. Of course, the reason for implementing the authority is to maintain the stability of the U.S. financial system. And lastly, and it's not insignificant by any means, is that, and this basically goes to the basis of most insolvency frameworks, is that the resolution of the financial company itself, the insolvency process, has to recognize priorities, and creditors have to understand where they will basically come out in that waterfall. An important, I'll call a subpart of that, is that taxpayers associated with this process shouldn't even be on the list. So quickly how this would occur is that the very top holding company would go into the insolvency process. And by doing so, the creditors and stakeholders of the holding company itself are the ones who are going to be bearing the loss. This provides a clarity as to who suffers loss first. Paul made reference to basically structural subordination, and that's exactly what is occurring here, which hasn't really been clear in other types of insolvency processes. It's not even clear actually in small bank failures, because you have that issue associated with the litigation between the holding company and the subsidiaries that is almost inevitable in the vast majority of situations, where there is basically arguments over who has what rights to which assets, and there might be tax receivables that are coming, there might be actual physical assets at hand that are in question, or there might be actually obligations that need to be discerned as to where they actually reside. Those basically are eliminated by just having the one, or I should say minimized, one insolvency process. The other big aspect associated with this, which is critically important, is in order to minimize the consequences and systemic implications of the failures at the operating companies, the companies that actually do the day-to-day business, the companies that actually interconnect with the rest of the financial system in a meaningful way other than just as an investor, or I'll call it a long-term creditor, because the way the structure is evolving, those services can continue. Those critical services are not directly impacted because those subsidiaries that provide those services continue to do business. Now, there is a mechanism that has been used a number of times for bank failures here in the United States, and it was carried over into the Title II framework. It's called a bridge bank or bridge company mechanism. And this allows for the immediate transfer of the assets and operations of that holding company, or any entity for that matter, into a newly created chartered entity that can immediately take those on. And in the case of our SIFI resolution process, we aren't talking about operating entities or activities at the holding company. We're talking basically transferring the assets of the holding company, which for the most part will be shares in those operating subsidiaries, or the equity investment that the holding company had in those operating subsidiaries, over to this bridge financial company. But then the obligations that are on the liability side of the balance sheet, except for the secured ones, will remain back as a claim in the receivership estate. So if you think about the balance sheet of this bridge company on day one, it has all of these assets on the one side, and we can talk about the value of those momentarily. And then on the liability side, it basically has equity investment in bridge company, which basically is then a claim on that bridge company to the creditors of the receivership estate. So that is sort of step number one. Critically important because of the anger associated with the bailout moral hazard issue. The officers, directors, those culpable for the failure have to be replaced. The law requires that. But I think the market requires it as well. If in fact the strategy of the business model resulted in the failure of the company, the market's going to demand that changes be made. Now, where I think there's an exception to this, of course, and that's because these people wouldn't be culpable, is many times white knights are brought in. Many times executives are brought in 6 months prior to failure to try to resurrect the company, save the company, try to change that path to to resolution, and this does afford the ability to maintain those resources in place. So you now have this bridge company, and you're going to have it run by a new executive and members of the board of directors. And so there will be an operating agreement that gives them direction as to how they need to go about satisfying certain operational issues, because certainly one of the concerns that will arise from the operations of this bridge company until it exits the process is, will it be rationalizing its operations to cure the causes of failure? And that needs to obviously commence as quickly as possible. They need to be discovered and they need to be cured, because otherwise when it exits the process, the market isn't going to believe the company is viable. This is basically the process in a nutshell. Now, unfortunately, this print is much too small for you to read out there in the audience, but I'm going to kind of explain what this graph illustrates, this bar chart. So on the left-hand side is your pre-failure liability stack, equity stack of the firm. And the dark blue is your equity component, your red is your subordinated debt component, your green is your senior debt component, and at the top of that stack there you see a little purple slice, and that is your secured liability component. So that's what it looks like pre-failure. Now, of course, what happens when one of these institutions fails is that there are losses that are incurred at the operating company level, and they flow up to be reflected on the balance sheet of the topco. And the assets effectively are repriced. And you change the left-hand side of the balance sheet, you change the right-hand side of the balance sheet. And on the right here, you see what the effect of that is. The light green there is basically the loss that has been imposed on those assets. And there's a red line that goes across both bars, which shows you how high up the old liability and equity stack of the failed firm it penetrates. So the old equity is wiped out, subordinated debt is essentially wiped out, and even a little bit of the unsecured debt is wiped out by the losses. The new equity is kind of the teal color there. I guess that's actually more of a salmon color. Let's take that back. And the new equity is basically the product of converting the claims from the unsecured debt into new shares of stock. That new equity might have some contingent value rights associated with it. In fact, I would argue that's almost necessary, an absolute necessity, because there will be very legitimate arguments about the value of the assets associated with the firm. So even though this has been sort of quantified as an exact amount, the reality is there has to be some type of contingent value rights associated with the payment of the claims to the unsecured debt holders in this example, and the shares that they receive will have some type of contingent value rights associated with them as well. Then we'll have a layer of new subordinated convertible debt in order to accommodate for the asset value uncertainty, because the contingent value rights help on one side if you have overestimated your losses, but if you have underestimated your losses, you have perhaps not set up a company that is viable without having an ability to infuse more equity into it. So having some new subordinated convertible debt seems like it would be prudent. And then finally, you have a very thin slice of unsecured debt, that term debt that basically remains from the prior unsecured debt class. And of course, secured is still secured up there at the top, even though it might be a different color. Now, in order to make this process work, you obviously need a sufficient amount and type of loss-absorbing debt for recapitalization. The insolvency framework must provide the authorities with a way of rapidly transferring the operations and assets of the failed entity to a successor entity. You obviously have to stay the acceleration and termination of derivative contracts to avoid the fire sales and the cascading effects resulting from those. You need a top-tier holding company that is relatively free of either operational obligations or other types of contractual obligations that impede the resolution process. And so one example of that would be a guarantee of not necessarily a derivative contract, but a guarantee of another type of obligation that is at the operating company level that then causes the counterparty to that to basically say, I can't honor that agreement anymore because of the credit support or other guarantee of that holding company. Lastly, I mentioned about the need for liquidity, but there are two aspects of this which are really important. The pre-planning aspects of it, and then also the transparency and expectations that arise from it. Pre-planning, coordinating with counterparties, and by those, I'm not really talking about financial counterparties. I'm really talking about the resolution authorities and supervisors and regulators about how this process would unfold and who needs to do what is a very important component of it. And even though there will always be unforeseen circumstances that arise, no question, it's much better to be well ahead of that process than thinking about it for the first time at the 11th hour. Secretary Geithner, former Secretary Geithner, used to have an expression, plan beats no plan. Any plan beats no plan. And he's correct because you would have thought through issues.
Yes, could have paused there.
Yes.